All right, let's jump right in. We're going to talk about a strategy that, for decades, has been held up as a way to completely transform the lives of people with disabilities, especially in the developing world. It's called Community-Based Rehabilitation, or CBR. It's a really powerful idea, but the huge question we're tackling in this explainer is, does it actually work?
To really get why this is so important, you first have to understand the sheer scale of the issue. Globally, we think there are at least 650 million people living with a disability. I mean, just think about that. That's about 10% of the entire world's population. And, in developing countries where resources are already stretched so thin, that number is probably a massive underestimate.
Now, here's where things get really complicated and, honestly, pretty tragic. There's this link between disability and poverty. Experts call it a vicious cycle. See, poverty can cause disability through things like malnutrition or not having access to healthcare. And at the same time, having a disability can push you into poverty by shutting you out of school or a job. Each one makes the other worse, and it traps millions and millions of people.
So that's the enormous challenge, right? When you realize that 1 out of every 5 of the world's absolute poorest people has a disability, breaking this cycle suddenly becomes one of the biggest development issues on the planet. How in the world do you intervene in something that big? Where do you even begin?
Well, that very question led to a huge revolutionary shift in thinking. The whole idea was to stop focusing only on a person's impairment and instead to move from a world of isolation to one of inclusion, where everyone is part of society.
And to really get this revolution, you have to see these two completely different ways of looking at disability. For a long time, we had the medical model. It saw disability as a purely medical problem with an individual that needed to be fixed, and this thinking often led to people being sent away, institutionalized. But then came the social model, which just flips that whole idea on its head. It says the problem isn't the person. The problem is the barriers that society puts up, buildings you can't get into, no job opportunities, bad attitudes. This shift in perspective is everything.
And right out of that social model came this idea, community-based rehabilitation. Now, the official definition from a joint paper by the World Health Organization and others calls it a strategy for rehabilitation, equal opportunities, and social inclusion. So, you see, the key theme here is that it's not just about medicine or therapy. It's way bigger. It's about community development. It's about human rights.
And this whole philosophy is captured perfectly in this incredibly powerful motto from the disability rights movement, nothing about us without us. It's so simple and so profound. It just means that people with disabilities have to be at the heart of designing and running the programs that affect their own lives. They're the experts, after all.
So how does this actually look in practice? Well, it takes a really holistic approach, looking at what you could call the entire universe of well-being. You've got 5 key parts. There's health, of course, but there's also education, livelihood, meaning jobs and money, social life, and this last one is so important, empowerment. A good program knows that you can't just focus on one slice. All 5 are connected.
Okay, so it's an inspiring idea, right? It's a comprehensive framework. It all sounds great on paper. But great ideas don't always translate into great results. So you have to ask the tough question. After all these years, what does the evidence actually say? Does CBR really work?
And this is where things get really, really tricky. One review of all the research out there summed it up with this perfect phrase, evidence poor but data rich. So what on earth does that mean? Well, it means there are tons and tons of reports and stories about CBR projects happening all over the globe. That's the data-rich part. But, and this is a big but, there's almost no hard scientific proof, no rigorous studies that show which parts actually work and why. That's the evidence-poor part.
So if you were to draw up a report card for CBR, you'd see a really mixed bag. On one side, you have all these amazing stories of success. People becoming more independent in their day-to-day lives, what researchers call ADLs, or activities of daily living. They feel more a part of their communities. They get into schools and find jobs. But then, on the other side, you have these huge systemic problems that just won't go away. Bad management, programs that don't fit the local culture, and the never-ending fight to keep the money flowing.
So with these mixed results, people started to ask a smarter question. Instead of asking, does it work? They started asking, okay, when it does work,
What's the secret? What's the engine that's actually driving the success?
And the answer seems to boil down to one critical thing: the locus of power. Where does the power lie? The programs that succeed, the ones that make a real difference, are the ones that actually shift decision-making power into the hands of people with disabilities and their own communities. It's about getting away from this top-down, we know what's best for you charity model and moving to a bottom-up model of real empowerment.
And if you want a perfect picture of what this looks like, check out this incredible story from a researcher in Uganda. A village representative for disabled people was given this tiny budget, like the equivalent of 30 pounds. So what did he do? He didn't write a big proposal. He bought 6 pigs. He gave them to the wealthiest family to look after, and then every time a pig had a litter, he took one of the piglets and gave it to a family with a disabled person. And pretty soon, he'd given almost every single disabled person in his area a pig, a real concrete asset that gives them food and income. That, right there, is what grassroots empowerment is all about.
Now, that kind of on-the-ground empowerment is supposed to be supported by this whole structure. You've got the national level making policies, then the intermediate or district level with managers coordinating everything. But honestly, that piglet story shows you exactly where the real magic happens. It's right there, at the community level, when local people are actually trusted to come up with their own solution.
So, how do we fix this? How do we bridge that gap between the fantastic idea of CBR and its often messy reality on the ground? Well, the research actually points to a pretty clear path forward. The recommendations are pretty straightforward, and they cover all the bases. Down at the community level, it's all about empowering those local groups and making sure programs actually respect the local culture. Then, at the national level, governments have to get their act together and coordinate between the health ministry, the education ministry, the labor ministry, and create clear ways for people to get the help they need. And finally, internationally, all these big organizations need to stop working in their own little silos, share their data, and actually support the local networks doing the real work.
And all of this leaves us with one last big thought. Community-based rehabilitation is without a doubt a powerful, humane, and brilliant idea. But its story proves something really important. A powerful idea is never enough on its own. It really makes you ask a much bigger question, one that goes way beyond this single strategy. What does it really take to turn a grand vision for a better world into a real, measurable, sustainable reality for the people who need it most?